Portland International Airport, the afternoon before Thanksgiving, 1971, was busy in the particular way airports get busy the day before a major holiday. Crowded ticket counters, families with too much luggage, everyone in a hurry to get somewhere else before the weather turned. Into that ordinary chaos walked a quiet man in a business suit and a black tie who stepped up to the Northwest Orient Airlines counter and bought a one-way ticket to Seattle, paying cash. He gave the name Dan Cooper, the name the entire world would come to know him by, DB. Cooper was never actually his alias at all. It was a wire service reporting error in the chaotic hours after the hijacking broke when a journalist misattributed the name to a different man briefly questioned by police, and once United Press International ran with it, every other newsroom in the country followed. Half a century of books, documentaries, and FBI press releases have carried a name that, as best anyone can tell, the hijacker himself never used. Within a few hours, he would vanish out the back of a Boeing 727 somewhere over the Pacific Northwest wilderness, carrying $200,000 in ransom money, and he would never be seen again. More than 50 years later, the FBI still calls it the only unsolved commercial aircraft hijacking in American history. The man who boarded Northwest Orient Flight 305 that afternoon looked entirely unremarkable, mid-40s, dark raincoat, white shirt, a black clip-on tie from JCPenney. He took seat 18C in the last row of the passenger cabin, ordered a bourbon and soda, and lit a cigarette. Nothing about him drew a second look from the 36 other passengers or the flight crew. That was, as it turned out, exactly the point. Nothing about his behavior in the terminal or in his seat suggested anything was wrong. He paid for his bourbon and soda in cash and left a normal tip. He didn't fidget, didn't check his watch, didn't glance around the cabin the way a nervous man might. Witnesses who later tried to help a police sketch artist recall him would end up disagreeing with each other on his exact height, his eye color, and even his age within a 10-year range, which is part of why the composite drawing the FBI eventually released never matched any single confirmed photograph of anyone connected to the case. He was, in the most literal sense, a forgettable man, and that may have been the most important part of the entire plan. Shortly after takeoff, the men passed a folded note to a flight attendant named Florence Schaffner. She was 23 years old, and she assumed, as flight attendants often did in that era, that a man passing her a note was giving her his phone number. She slipped it into her pocket without reading it. He leaned toward her and said quietly that she should look at the note. She did.
"Miss, I have a bomb in my briefcase, and I want you to sit by me."
Schaffner sat down beside him as instructed, doing her best not to let her face show what she'd just read. He opened the briefcase just enough for her to see the contents, a tangle of wires connected to what looked like a large battery and several red cylindrical sticks arranged in a row. Hers. He closed it again almost immediately, as if he'd made his point and didn't need to belabor it. Whether it was ever a functioning bomb has never been established, since Cooper made sure it was never examined by anyone in a position to know. But no one on that airplane, from the flight attendant sitting beside him to the pilots up front receiving his demand secondhand, was willing to test the theory that it wasn't real. His demands were specific and, for the era, oddly procedural: $200,000 in what he called negotiable American currency, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck standing by when they landed in Seattle. He did not ask to be flown anywhere unusual, did not rant, did not threaten the other passengers directly. He asked Schaffner to pass the note to the cockpit and to tell the captain to relay his demands to the ground. Captain William Scott got on the radio to Seattle-Tacoma Air Traffic Control, who looped in Seattle Police, the FBI, and Northwest Orient's headquarters in Minneapolis, relaying Cooper's demands almost word for word as Schaffner had passed them forward from the cabin. It was an unusual position for a commercial airline captain to be in, negotiating. through a chain of relayed radio messages for the lives of everyone on his aircraft while flying slow, deliberate circles over a major American city in broad daylight with no way to know whether the man in seat 18C was bluffing or not. What followed was nearly 2 hours of the airplane circling over Puget Sound in a deliberate holding pattern, burning fuel and time, while on the ground a small army of bankers, airline employees, and federal agents raced to assemble exactly what the hijacker had asked for. The other 36 passengers, sitting just a few rows away from the man with the briefcase, were never told any of this. The crew announced only that their arrival in Seattle would be delayed by a minor mechanical difficulty, and most of them boarded their connecting flights that evening having no idea they had just spent 2 hours circling a city while a hijacking played out at the back of their own airplane. Seattle First National Bank supplied 10,000 individual $20 bills, a deliberate choice since larger denominations would have been easier to carry but far easier for a fleeing man to be caught spending in small-town stores. Before the money left the vault, a bank employee ran every single bill past a camera and photographed its serial number by hand, one at a time, on the theory that if this ended badly, at least the money itself might eventually testify. When the plane finally landed at SeaTac, just after 5:30 that evening, it was parked in an isolated corner of the airfield, away from the terminal, ringed at a distance by police and federal agents who had been told in no uncertain terms not to approach the aircraft or do anything that might provoke the man holding it hostage. A Northwest Orient employee walked out alone to meet flight attendant Tina Mucklow at the base of the aircraft's rear stairway, carrying a canvas bag containing the ransom and 4 parachutes, 2 primary chutes and 2 reserves, one of which happened to be an old instructional rig with its canopy sewn shut, unusable for an actual jump. Cooper had the money and the chutes checked and brought aboard. In exchange, he released all 36 passengers and 2 of the flight attendants, who filed off the aircraft into the darkness, not yet knowing how close the situation had actually come to something far worse. Only the pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, and Tina Mucklow remained on board with him. Cooper's next instructions were unusual enough that the flight crew had never heard anything like them. He wanted the plane flown toward Mexico City, with a refueling stop along the way, but he specified exact operating conditions, landing gear down for the entire flight, wing flaps locked at 15 degrees, cabin left unpressurized, altitude held below 10,000 feet, and airspeed no faster than 200 knots. Those numbers were not random. They were the precise conditions under which a Boeing 727 could be flown safely with its rear air stair deployed and open in mid-flight, something no passenger jet had ever been asked to do before, and something only someone with real knowledge of the aircraft systems would have any reason to know. The 727 was, at the time, one of the only commercial jets in the world built with a stairway built directly into its tail section, designed so the aircraft could load and unload passengers at small airports without a jet bridge. It was a genuinely unusual piece of engineering, and Cooper appeared to understand exactly how to use it as an exit no one had planned for. The Air Force scrambled 2 F-106 fighter jets out of McChord Air Force Base, along with a T-33 training jet that happened to be nearby, to shadow the airliner from a discreet distance and report anything they saw. It was an awkward assignment by design. The fighters had to stay far enough back and high enough that Cooper wouldn't spot them and panic, which meant they were essentially flying blind support for an aircraft they couldn't get close enough to actually watch. Between the darkness, the low cloud cover, and the freezing rain moving through the region that night, none of the chase planes ever caught sight of what happened next. Somewhere after 8 o'clock that evening, Cooper ordered Tina Mucklow into the cockpit and told her to stay there with the door closed. A short while later, the flight crew felt a distinct pressure bump in the cabin, the kind of sudden change in air pressure that happens when a large opening in a sealed aircraft is exposed to the outside atmosphere. It was roughly 8:13. The plane, at that moment, was somewhere over the wooded mountainous terrain near Ariel, Washington, in the vicinity of Lake Merwin and the Cowlitz River corridor, on a night with a wind chill well below freezing and nothing beneath the aircraft but dense forest and dark water. When the plane eventually landed in Reno for refueling, agents swarmed the aircraft immediately. Cooper was gone. The money was gone. Of the 4 parachutes delivered to him in Seattle, he had taken one working main chute and one of the reserves, and left behind the second reserve, the one that happened to be an unusable training rig with its canopy sewn permanently shut. That detail became its own small mystery within the larger one. An experienced skydiver would likely have inspected all 4 chutes closely enough to identify which reserve was a dummy, which cuts against theories that Cooper was a seasoned jumper who planned every detail. But choosing correctly at all, in a dim cabin, under pressure, with everyone he'd ever meet watching him decide, has also been read by others as a sign he knew exactly what he was doing. Investigators have never agreed on which reading is right. Along with the unused chute, he left his black clip-on tie, his tie clip, and 8 cigarette butts in the ashtray at his seat. By the time the plane touched down in Reno, and word reached newsrooms that the hijacker had actually jumped out of a moving airliner into the night, the story had already stopped being a routine crime report and turned into something closer to a national sensation. Within days, reporters from across the country had descended on the small towns near the presumed jump zone, interviewing loggers, hunters, and anyone else who might have seen or heard something the night of November 24th. Newspapers ran daily updates whether there was genuinely new information or not, and radio stations speculated openly about whether a man could survive a night parachute jump into freezing wilderness wearing nothing more than a business suit, loafers, and a raincoat. The uncertainty itself became the story. Nobody could say with confidence whether they were covering a manhunt for a fugitive or reporting on a death that simply hadn't been confirmed yet. What followed was one of the largest manhunts in FBI history up to that point. Agents, National Guard troops, and civilian volunteers combed the forests and waterways around Ariel and the Lewis River drainage for weeks, on foot and by helicopter, looking for a body, a parachute, a scrap of the ransom bag, anything. The terrain worked against them at every turn, steep, heavily timbered ridgelines, freezing overnight temperatures, near constant Pacific Northwest rain, and a region so remote that search teams sometimes needed a full day just to reach a single coordinate on the map. Bloodhounds were brought in and lost the scent almost immediately in the wet undergrowth. Search aircraft flying low over the canopy could see barely a fraction of the ground beneath the tree cover, and ground teams on foot were often moving through brush so dense that 2 searchers 10 feet apart couldn't see each other. They found nothing. No trace of Cooper, dead or alive, turned up anywhere near the presumed jump zone, not that winter and not for years afterward. Amateur searchers, private investigators, and at least one FBI-organized dig using ground-penetrating equipment would return to those same hillsides over the following decades, and every one of them came back empty-handed. The FBI opened a formal case file under the name NORJAC for Northwest hijacking, and the list of possible suspects grew rapidly. Businessmen with grudges, ex-military parachutists, airline employees, career criminals who happened to match the vague physical description. By the case's 5th anniversary, agents had considered more than 800 names and eliminated all but a couple of dozen from serious contention. Over the decades that followed, that number would eventually climb past 1,000. For nearly 9 years, the case produced no physical evidence at all beyond what had been left on the plane. Then, in February of 1980, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was on a family picnic along a stretch of the Columbia River known as Tina Bar, north of Vancouver, Washington. He was digging a shallow pit in the sandy riverbank to build a small campfire when his fingers hit something that wasn't a rock. He uncovered 3 disintegrating packets of cash, still held together by rotting rubber bands, the paper soft and swollen from years underground and underwater. It was $5,800, and when the FBI compared the serial numbers against the photograph list from 1971, they matched exactly. It was, and remains to this day, the only piece of the ransom money ever recovered. Rather than solving the case, the discovery deepened it. Sandbar sits roughly 20 miles from where investigators believe Cooper had actually jumped, which by itself raised the obvious question of how the money traveled that far. Decades later, a paleontologist named Tom Kay took a fresh look at the recovered bills under a microscope and found something the original investigators had no way to detect: traces of diatoms, microscopic algae embedded in the deteriorated cash. Those particular diatoms are only active in the Columbia River during spring and summer. Cooper jumped in late November. If the money picked up those organisms while submerged, it means the cash entered the water many months after the hijacking itself, not the night Cooper disappeared, which undercuts the simplest explanation that it simply washed downstream from his landing site. Kay has argued the evidence more closely resembles debris pulled up and redeposited by a dredging operation than money that drifted there naturally, which would mean the connection between Sandbar and Cooper's actual jump zone is far weaker than it first appeared. Why only a small fraction of the ransom ever turned up, how it got to that riverbank, and what any of it says about whether Cooper survived the jump at all remain questions no one has answered with any confidence. The case took an unexpected detour just months after the original hijacking, when a very different man attempted something almost identical. On April 7, 1972, a Vietnam veteran, decorated Army helicopter pilot, and Sunday school teacher named Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. boarded United Airlines Flight 855, traveling from Denver to Los Angeles under the alias James Johnson. Once airborne, he produced a novelty hand grenade and an unloaded pistol, claimed he had a bomb, and demanded $500,000 along with parachutes. Like Cooper, he jumped from the rear of the aircraft with the ransom, this time somewhere over Utah. Unlike Cooper, he made a critical mistake. He left behind a copy of United's in-flight passenger magazine on the seat next to his, and FBI fingerprint examiners matched a single latent print on its pages to a set on file from his years in military service. Investigators had a name within 48 hours, and agents arrested him at his home in Provo, Utah, 3 days after the hijacking, where they found nearly all of the ransom money still wrapped in its original bank bands, hidden inside a cardboard box alongside his own parachute and skydiving harness. McCoy was convicted of air piracy and sentenced to 45 years. He didn't serve them. 2 years into his sentence, McCoy staged an escape from the federal penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, using a fake pistol carved from dental paste and shoe polish to get past guards, then crashed a garbage truck through the prison's front gate. He stayed free for 3 months before FBI agents tracked him to a house in Virginia Beach in November of 1974. When agents moved in, McCoy opened fire. He was killed in the gunfight that followed at the age of 31. Because McCoy's copycat hijacking so closely mirrored Cooper's methods, some investigators speculated for years that they might be the same man, a theory the FBI ultimately dismissed based on physical descriptions and timeline inconsistencies. The theory resurfaced with new force in 2024, when McCoy's own adult children, Shantae and Richard III, came forward publicly with a claim that their late father had, in fact, been D.B. Cooper. According to their account, after their mother's death, they discovered a parachute and a logbook in a shed on the family property in North Carolina that they believe ties directly back to the 1971 case. They brought what they'd found to a retired airline pilot and aviation researcher named Dan Grider, who has spent years investigating the case independently. What's happened since is contested and, as of this recording, unconfirmed by any official source. Reporting based on the family's account, and Grider's research describes DNA samples being collected from McCoy's surviving children in an attempt to compare them against the partial genetic profile recovered decades earlier from the tie Cooper left behind on the plane, and even a request to exhume McCoy's remains for a direct comparison. None of this has been verified through an official FBI statement, and it's worth remembering that the FBI formally suspended its active investigation into the Cooper case back in 2016. Whether this new evidence ever produces a conclusive answer, or simply becomes the latest chapter in a 50-year pattern of promising leads that go nowhere, is still an open question. Hoy was far from the only name attached to the case over the years. Kenneth Christensen, a former Army paratrooper who later worked for Northwest Orient as a mechanic and flight purser, was proposed as a suspect by his own brother after watching a television documentary about the case, years after Christensen's death in 1994. Robert Rackstraw, a Vietnam veteran with a parachute training background and a lengthy criminal record of his own, was named as a leading candidate in a 2016 television documentary. He denied it publicly before his death in 2019. Two other suspects came from an even more personal source, family members convinced they had been living with the truth for years. In 1995, a man named Dwayne Weber told his wife, Jo, on his deathbed that he had a secret to tell her. According to her account, he said, "I have a secret to tell you. I'm Dan Cooper." Jo Weber later recalled her husband talking in his sleep about leaving fingerprints on a plane, and he had an old knee injury he'd once explained away as the result of a parachute jump. The FBI took the claim seriously enough to test his DNA, and in 2007, that DNA excluded him as a match to the partial genetic profile recovered from Cooper's tie. Then, in 2011, a woman named Marla Cooper came forward with a family story of her own. She told investigators that when she was 8 years old, she overheard her uncle, Lynn Doyle Cooper, tell a relative, "Our money problems are over. We hijacked an airplane." Marla and her mother turned over one of L.D. Cooper's old guitar straps to the FBI in hopes of lifting a usable fingerprint or DNA sample, but the material had degraded too much to yield anything conclusive either way. Like nearly every other name attached to this case, it ended not with an answer, but with an asterisk. None of these theories have ever produced the kind of hard, unambiguous evidence that would let the FBI close the case with an actual name.
It was just time to close the case because there isn't anything new out there.
On July 8, 2016, the FBI formally announced it was redirecting the resources it had spent nearly 45 years devoting to the Cooper investigation toward other priorities. It wasn't a declaration that the case was solved or that it never would be. It was, more simply, an acknowledgement that after 800, then 1,000, then more than 1,000 suspects, the trail had gone as cold as it was ever going to get through conventional investigation. Multiple generations of agents had rotated through the file over 4.5 decades, inheriting boxes of evidence, tip letters, and dead ends from the investigators who came before them, and every one of them eventually reached the same wall. To this day, it remains the only unsolved hijacking of a commercial aircraft in the history of American aviation. Somewhere along the way, Cooper stopped being simply a fugitive and became something closer to folklore. Songs were written about him. A 1981 feature film dramatized the case with Treat Williams playing a fictionalized version of the hijacker as a kind of blue-collar anti-hero, a working man who beat the system and got away clean. In the small town of Ariel, Washington, not far from where investigators believe he came down, locals still gather every year on the Saturday after Thanksgiving for an event called DB. Cooper Days. Part reunion, part amateur investigator convention, part excuse to keep telling a story that refuses to end. It's a strange kind of celebrity for a man who, if he survived it all, committed an armed hijacking and then let a plane load of frightened strangers believe they might not make it home for the holiday. The case left a lasting, very physical mark on commercial aviation that has nothing to do with whether Cooper was ever identified. Within a year of the hijacking, Boeing engineers developed a simple mechanical device that could be retrofitted onto the rear air stairs of existing 727s, making it physically impossible for anyone to lower them again while the aircraft was in flight. It became known, informally but permanently, as the Cooper vane, a small piece of hardware named after a man whose real identity has never been confirmed on every 727 that carried it for the rest of the aircraft's service life. The Cooper vane wasn't the only lasting change. Cooper's apparent success, and the runaway media coverage that followed, set off a wave of more than a dozen copycat hijackings across the country within the following year, each one following roughly the same template: claim a bomb, demand cash, ask for a parachute, jump. Most of the copycats were caught. A few were not. But the sheer volume of attempts forced a reckoning inside the aviation industry and the federal government that had been avoidable for years. On January 5, 1973, the Federal Aviation Administration made a decision that would permanently change what it means to fly in the United States: mandatory metal detector screening and X-ray inspection of carry-on luggage at every commercial airport in the country, for every passenger, no exceptions. A federal court upheld the requirement that same year, ruling that the government's interest in preventing hijackings outweighed the inconvenience to travelers. Every metal detector, every X-ray belt, every request to empty your pockets before boarding a flight today traces its lineage back, in part, to a quiet man in a business suit who proved, in one afternoon, exactly how easy it still was to walk onto an airplane with a bomb, real or not, and disappear. Over the decades, the FBI released multiple 8-progression sketches of Cooper, updating the original composite drawing every few years to show what he might look like as he aged, first into his 50s, later into his 70s and 80s, on the chance he was still alive somewhere and someone might recognize him at a grocery store or a family gathering. No sighting from any of those releases was ever substantiated. The Bureau also maintained for years a standing offer to test DNA and fingerprints against the case file for any credible suspect. A member of the public brought forward an offer that produced Dwayne Weber, Marla Cooper's uncle, and dozens of other names, and eliminated nearly all of them. More than half a century later, the wooded hills around Ariel, Washington, still draw amateur searchers every year, walking the same drainage systems the FBI once combed with hundreds of agents, looking for a rusted parachute buckle or a rotted strap that might finally close the file. Most leave with nothing more than the same questions investigators had in 1971: who he really was, whether he survived a night jump into freezing forests wearing nothing more than a business suit and a raincoat, how $5,800 ended up buried in a riverbank 9 years later while the rest of a $200,000 ransom vanished completely, and why, of every hijacker in the history of American aviation, this is the one nobody has ever been able to name for certain. Every other case on this record eventually closed, one way or another, with a body, a confession, or an arrest. This one never did, and at this point, it may never,